Hey, what's going on out there, everybody? So, welcome to my series on this channel called Retro Super Bowl, where basically I will do reviews from past Super Bowls that took place 20 or 30 years ago, whatever type of Super Bowl and all that stuff. But in this video, I thought what I would do for the first Super Bowl review the first past Super Bowl review is do a review of the Pirate Bowl or the John Gruden Bowl. That's right, the Super Bowl, I think it was Super Bowl 37, I believe, where the Raiders lost their former coach in John Gruden, where they got absolutely destroyed 48-21 by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And what makes that Super Bowl loss absolutely crazy is the fact that the Raiders, they went from being a Super Bowl contender to just being a bottom franchise for the next 14 seasons. In other words, the Raiders would go from being a Super Bowl winning contender to just being a team that was always at the back end of memes and just being the laughing stock of the NFL, in other words, from 2002 to 2016, because obviously it wouldn't be until 2016 when the Raiders would officially break their playoff drought and finally make the playoffs with Derek Carr, Jack Del Rio, Khalil Mack, Amari Cooper, and all that stuff. And of course, the thing about that Super Bowl, the crazy part about that Super Bowl, obviously, is the fact that Barrett Robbins, the Raiders' starting center at that time, went missing, which was a huge blow for the Raiders' offensive line, because I guess that Barrett Robbins was the guy that called all the shots, basically made the plays, or basically called the plays, how the Raiders were going to run the ball, which route the running back was supposed to run and all that stuff, because apparently, in that Super Bowl, the Raiders' offensive line outweighed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' defensive line, because as you guys know, that year, I believe in 2002, I think it was the Raiders who had the number one offense in the league that year, and the Buccaneers, of course, had the number one defense in the league that year. So obviously the biggest challenge that the Raiders had, obviously, in that Super Bowl was how on earth were they going to move the ball against the top-ranked Buccaneers defense that featured guys like Dwight Smith, Dexter Jackson, that also featured, I'm trying to think of another guy's name, Warren Sapp, of course, can't forget about Warren Sapp. So, of course, it seemed like that the Raiders were screwed right before the Super Bowl when, their starting center, Barrett Robbins, went missing, because apparently Barrett Robbins, I guess, appeared to have suffered a nervous breakdown, because apparently, according to Tim Brown, Bill Callahan, originally the Raiders were supposed to run the ball on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but instead what ended up happening was that Bill Callahan, 2 days before the Super Bowl, changed the Raiders' game plan completely from a running game to just a very passing-oriented game, and that basically really backfired for the Raiders, because, the thing that's crazy about that Super Bowl is John Gruden, the former Raiders coach at that time, knew the plays the Raiders were going to run. That's right, I'm not even kidding, because a big reason why that blowout even happened in that Super Bowl is because it does help when the plays that your former team and quarterback is going to run, then that's going to give you a big benefit. So I think that definitely did give the Buccaneers a huge advantage in that Super Bowl in knowing the plays the Raiders were going to run. And of course, it's just crazy to see how, because obviously, in the early 2000s, the Raiders were actually a really good team. They were always in contention for a Super Bowl under John Gruden. From 2000 to 2002, the Raiders, they were a pretty good team, I would have to say, for the most part. They were a good team, but of course, after 2002, the Raiders, they would just never, ever be that same team again, because they went from being Super Bowl contenders in 2002 to being a complete former shell of their former selves up until 2016, of course, when that's the year that the Raiders made the playoffs finally for the first time since 2002. But it's just crazy to see how, you're trying to figure out how are you going to move the ball against the top-ranked defense in the Super Bowl. And you would think that, hey, if the Raiders running the ball is what's going to help them against the Buccaneers in that Super Bowl, then that's what the Raiders should have stuck with, in my opinion. It does feel a bit weird to see the Raiders coach, and these are not my claims, of course, these are Tim Brown's claims. And of course, Jerry Rice, when you have the greatest receiver of all time, and Jerry Rice basically supports Tim Brown's claims, then this is something that I feel like needs to be talked about more, is why would, what Tim Brown is accusing Bill Callahan of doing, why would the coach change the Raiders playbook at the last second? That, of course, is very suspect, that I just think a lot of people should be talking more about, because I apparently statistically, according to the statistics, excuse me, can't even talk straight, but I just know that the Raiders' offensive line outweighed the Buccaneers' defensive line in that Super Bowl by like, what, 60 pounds or whatever. So, of course, the Raiders outweighing the Buccaneers' front seven, that should have given the Raiders, I feel like, an advantage in that Super Bowl in just being able to run the ball against the Buccaneers, but they didn't do that. They just decided to pass the ball, and of course, the Buccaneers, they had a 34-3 lead against the Raiders in that Super Bowl at one point before the Raiders tried to make a comeback. But then, of course, Rich Gannon, he threw two game-losing interceptions. I think those were, I think they were interceptions that were returned for touchdowns, because if I remember in that Super Bowl, Rich Gannon, he threw two interceptions to Dwight Smith, and he returned both of those, I believe, for a touchdown as well. So the way how that Super Bowl ended for the Raiders, it ended in the worst way possible. So it was one thing for the Raiders to get absolutely embarrassed by their former coach in the Super Bowl, but for a team to never be the same for the next 14 seasons after that Super Bowl loss is absolutely insane. Yes, that's right. Because obviously after that Super Bowl, it seemed like that the Raiders entered a period of losing, just not being able to be a good team at all. It seemed like that they just entered a period where they really just had nothing to be excited about and or try to figure out how to be a Super Bowl team again. Because obviously the low point in that period came when they drafted Jamarcus Russell in 2007, who along with Ryan Leaf turned out to be one of the biggest busts in NFL history. But it's just crazy to me how a Super Bowl loss can have such a devastating impact on a franchise. Seriously. So the way how I see it, in a way, I kind of do support Tim Brown's claims, because if you think about it, if Jerry Rice, the greatest receiver, will support Tim Brown's claims, then we need to start a conversation about that, because I feel like that Tim Brown's claims are definitely credible to an extent. But however, Bill Romanowski, the linebacker for the Raiders at that time, I believe, disagrees with Tim Brown's claims, and he believes that Tim Brown's claims are completely false. But I think in a way, though, we should kind of think here that maybe the Super Bowl would have actually been different had the Raiders just ran the ball instead of just Bill Callahan changing the Raiders playbook, because I guess that is the main reason why Barrett Robbins ended up missing the nights before the Super Bowl, and he went all the way to Tijuana to go out and party and all that stuff. And, he was obviously hungover from partying, I guess. And as much as Al Davis wanted him to play in that Super Bowl, I guess Bill Callahan determined he wasn't fit for the game. So Barrett Robbins didn't even, I guess, see a single snap in the Super Bowl. So that basically was, I guess, the main reason why the Raiders offensively struggled in the Super Bowl against the Buccaneers and all that stuff. But yeah, I just thought I had to come on and talk about this. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is that apparently, I guess Barrett Robbins appeared to have confronted Bill Callahan on changing the playbook, because obviously, according to Tim Brown's claims, Barrett Robbins told Bill Callahan that, hey, that he doesn't have time to prepare and all that stuff. But of course, Bill Callahan just decided to stick with the change and all that stuff. And, that just basically completely derailed the Raiders' hopes in that Super Bowl, because obviously, apparently, what I read is that the Raiders spent, I guess, 4 days trying to figure out how to run the ball against the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl. And then the last 2 days, and then to only have 2 days to figure out how you're going to how to figure out how are you going to have offensive success from the passing side of the game. That's going to really, I guess, derail teams' plans. So to sum things up, in a way, I would have to say I kind of do support Tim Brown's claims, because, it just doesn't make sense that the Raiders coach would change the playbook at the last second, because it's like, if running the ball is what's going to help you, help you find offensive success against the top-ranked Buccaneers defense, then why don't you just stick with that? Why do you have to change the playbook at the last second and just try to, basically, in a way, just, how they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, then why would you try to fix something that isn't broken? But yeah, that's pretty much the video here. I thought I would have to come on here and talk about this Super Bowl, because it's just crazy. Because after that Super Bowl, the Raiders just, to this day, 2002, it remains the last time the Raiders have won the AFC West, and the last time they've let alone won a playoff game. So yeah, this is crazy. But yeah, I really don't know which next Super Bowl I should talk about, which next past Super Bowl I should review. But overall, obviously, if you were a Chargers fan in that game, I imagine that the entire city of San Diego was pulling for the Buccaneers because, obviously the Raiders being the Chargers' divisional rivals 5 years prior at the Qualcomm Stadium, because Qualcomm Stadium is the stadium that hosted the Super Bowl, the home stadium of the San Diego Chargers at that time, because 5 years prior, I believe, yeah, it was 5 years prior, that the Denver Broncos under John Elway, they won the Super Bowl in the Chargers' own stadium at Qualcomm Stadium. So, of course, it was one thing for the Broncos to win the Super Bowl in the Chargers' own stadium, but I can't imagine how the city of San Diego would have reacted had the Raiders won the Super Bowl in the Chargers' own stadium. Like, that probably would have hurt the Chargers way more than the Broncos winning a Super Bowl in their own stadium. But, yeah, I guess at the end of the day here, the entire city of San Diego was pulling for the Buccaneers, and I imagine they were excited, of course, seeing the Raiders get blown out. Like, if you're a Chargers fan and you're seeing your hated rival get blown out like that in a Super Bowl, then I do imagine to an extent it's going to really excite the city of San Diego, because obviously the Raiders and the Chargers, they were always hated, bitter divisional rivals and all that. And yeah, it's just absolutely wild that's the way how the Super Bowl ended. The Buccaneers win 48-21, but the Raiders, on the other hand, have never really been the same team ever since that Super Bowl. But yeah, this was, of course, a year after the talk rule happened and all that. And just that Super Bowl, man, just I guess you could say, if you're a fan of NFL defenses, that was one of the most impressive defensive performances in a Super Bowl by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I can't tell which defensive performance by him in a Super Bowl was more impressive, that performance or their performance against the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl 2 years ago. But yeah, man, that's the video here. So let me know, do you guys support Tim Brown's claims, or do you side with Bill Romanowski? I'm curious to what you guys have to say about that. So that's about it. See ya.